All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us for our last week in the Archives in Crisis series. As many of you are aware, this series is an in-depth course on how to respond to rapid onset and slow onset crises. It's funded by a grant from the Louisiana Board of Regents Support Fund, the Gilbo Center for Public History, the Gilbo Charitable Trust, and the Department of History at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. We'd like to give thanks today to the Light Center for hosting us, AOC Media, which is in the back and has been filming the entirety of this series, replaying it on public television, as well as making it available on YouTube, and particularly our graduate assistants at the Gilbo Center for Public History. So I'm going to Summer Abukamra right here and Julia Fontenot, who have been integral in putting this series together. They did the research for all of our presenters. They helped construct all of the flyers. They set everything up. You name it, they have done it. And we are eternally grateful now that we're coming to the close of 8 weeks. That's quite a series to run. I am Liz Skilton. I'm one of the co-directors of the Gilbo Center for Public History at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, in addition to my colleagues Ian Beamish, who's right here, and Marissa Petru, who's right here. We have a couple of housekeeping announcements to do before we get started with things today. If you want to jump on the Light Center Wi-Fi, it is Light Public Wireless, and the password is lights, like lights above, at Light, L-I-T-E, like the Light Center, so lights at Light. While you're online, please follow the Department of History and the Gilbo Center for Public History online. So we are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, so stay up to date with our various social medias. In addition, you can go to the YouTube channel for the Department of History to catch up on this series, which is also posted on AOC Community Media's YouTube channel as well. Since this is our final week, I do not have any sort of introduction for any further lecture series at this time as part of the Archives in Crisis series, but I do want to mention that we're working hard for next year to plan series related to public history, and some of which will continue to look at this theme of Archives in Crisis, as the state, as we know from this series, is still facing many crises related to our archives. In addition, please stay aware of other Department of History related events, and you can find out about those through our social medias. Before Julia introduces our speaker, I'm going to have Summer Abukamra come up and talk about the Land Acknowledgement Initiative happening here at the center. And before she does, I just want to thank everybody for coming out on what it is a very rainy day and joining us for our final week in the series. It's been an absolute pleasure to host you for these 8 weeks, and we look forward to seeing you at events in the future. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Dr. Sloan. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the 24 indigenous tribes of Louisiana and pay our respects to the tribal elders, both past, present, and future, for stewarding this land so that we can carry out the work that we have planned for today. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Today's speaker is Stephen Sloan. He's the director of the Institute for Oral History and an associate professor of history at Baylor University. Dr. Sloan organizes research projects, leads community oral history initiatives, directs grants and contracts, and conducts field interviews. He is active in the national and international oral history community, a past president of the Oral History Association, and a presenter of his work abroad at academic conferences in Liverpool, Prague, Guadalajara, Naples, Istanbul, Buenos Aires, Barcelona, and Jyväskylä, Finland. Thank you.
Good morning, or good afternoon, I guess. Can you hear me? Okay, they asked me earlier when they put the mic on me if I'm a roamer, and I am a roamer. I don't like to stand in one place. So I'm happy to be with you today, and I wondered how you do with the avascula. It was a hard one. It took me a long time to get it down. That's where the International Oral History Association was last year. But I appreciate all of you coming. I made it in last night. There were some question marks at times. Whether I-10 shut down at one point, which was exciting because I didn't know another way to get here. But it's good to be here. We're going to do kind of a sprint through all sorts of oral history issues related to crisis. And so if we're a small enough group also, the good news about the school closures is we're a small enough group that if you have a question, just raise your hand. So there's going to be a Q&A section at the end, but don't hesitate to ask questions. If you go to academic presentations, anytime I chair an academic presentation, at the end I say, okay, there are comments and there are questions. I'll take questions. If you have a comment, keep it to yourself. No, I'm just kidding. You can share comments later, but if you got questions related to something that pops up, don't hesitate to ask. Some of you had experience with oral history, so if something resonates or if you have something to add, don't hesitate to add that as well. As was said, I am the director of the Institute for Oral History. This is how my wife prefers my face, but I've got enough relationship collateral now that I can do this every now and then. So, especially when I leave town, it's okay if I grow it out. So I'm director of the Institute for Oral History. Next year we'll celebrate our 50th year. And so we've been active for about 50 years recording oral histories on a variety of different topics. And that's our website there. I pointed out because we have other resources up there. We do online workshops, basic online workshops in oral history. We do advanced workshops in oral history. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. There's transcribing resources up there that I'll point out later, but you can find out more information about our work there. We collect, preserve, and present. We teach, mentor, and partner with undergraduate students and graduate students. And we write and publish our own material. We do a community oral history grant every year, or every other year. We partner with a community group in Texas where we provide some funding. We process the material for them. We partner with an external scholar every year. So if you're an individual scholar interested in doing oral history research, the Charlton Grant may be something you may want to be interested in. We give you money and then we transcribe your stuff. If you've ever transcribed, you'll understand the money is nice, but the transcription is really nice. And so that's something to keep in mind. Also at Baylor, we partner with faculty across campus to get them engaged in doing oral history research. So they know the questions that are important in their discipline. We know a good methodology they can use to research around those topics. And so we train them to do oral history, and then they go and research all sorts of things. Monique Ingalls on the left is doing an oral history project with gospel choirs in the UK, which is a resurgent phenomenon. They're not attached to a congregation. There's just these independent gospel choirs. Bracy Hill is doing interviews with traditional hunting families in Texas. Lakia Scott is doing interviews with 3 generations of African Americans in one family that all got STEM education at HBCUs. And so endless number of projects that can be done. We know the methodology to train them how to do it well, and they partner with us to create great collections, whether they're community-based collections or more academically based collections. So I want to hear at this point, so there's all sorts of things you can be with oral history. You can be a provider, you can be a facilitator, maker, presenter, processors, caretakers. We might have had more of a variety if the weather had cooperated in the room, but I am interested in what your engagement might be with oral history. Anybody used oral history before? Yes, Summer.
When I was at Loyola, I worked with Dr. Mark Fernandez, and he's writing a book through, sorry. Hello.
Wow, you just carry around a mic with you? That's impressive.
While at Loyola University for undergrad, I work with Dr. Mark Fernandez. He's currently working on publishing a book about Woody Guthrie, and I was his graduate, or his
student assistant, and so I helped him to transcribe oral histories through the Woody Guthrie Center in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Okay.
And the oral history interviews were very old. They were from the 60s and 70s, and they were done in a coffee shop, so you can hear the waitress in the back, asking, would you like some more coffee? And so
Yeah.
I worked on that, and I'll also be working in Boston for a little bit this summer. I have a contract position through the state of Massachusetts doing field interviews.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, wonderful. Yes. Did you have your hand up? Yeah.
Yeah. So I did oral histories in undergrad for a local history class about a controversy about building a bridge here.
Okay.
And then I'm currently doing oral histories with people who are related to a vigilante group that was here in the 1850s, and how the history of memory of those groups has survived locally.
Yeah, I work with a lot of scholars that are interested in 19th century history, and usually I'm helping them do the last chapter, which is the memory of that and kind of the ongoing life of it. Yes, ma'am.
I'm an archivist for a Native American tribe, the Kasha tribe. So I'm more of a facilitator, processor, and caretaker, especially because we mostly try to collect our oral histories in Kosati, the native language. So it's a little bit different.
Yeah, all sorts of challenges. I worked with the Mississippi Band of Choctaws, and so all sorts of unique challenges. Anybody else? Back on the back row. Okay. Everyone should bring their own mic next time. It would speed things up.
So Dr. Skelton, a few years ago, they were collecting oral interviews for 2 events. There's the 2016 flood that happened here, and then the Grand 16 shooting. And I helped collect oral histories for the 2016 flood one. And so, not only did that involve just, the stories of it, but we also gathered pictures, and we put where their house was, or their land, whatever property they owned, affected, on a map as well.
Okay, GIS, yeah. Very interesting. That's great. Okay, thank y'all for sharing. So we're going to kind of touch on a little bit of all these areas as we go throughout. I don't know who's going to be in the room. So we'll talk a little bit toward the archivists. We'll talk a little bit to the interviewers. We'll talk a little bit to the processors. And if you have particular questions as we go forward, don't hesitate to ask. Because we can think of oral history, some of us, if we're an archivist, we may think of oral history more as a source and an object that we're dealing with. And as a director of an oral history program, I have to think about those 6,500 objects I've got to deal with. I was just telling Liz, we're about to acquire a collection that's about 11,000 interviews. And I got to think about those 11,000 objects, where they're going to live and how we're going to take care of them, how we're going to keep them accessible, how we're going to make them available, all the questions that go along with that. If they're video-based, if they're audio-based, if they're paper-based, how do we take care of these sorts of things? But oral history is also, some of you may think it more as an approach or a project, this idea of conducting an oral history project. It's both these things. Oral history is a source, but it's also an approach and a project that we can use to understand an infinite number of phenomena. As we think of oral history as an object, some of the younger folks in the room may not understand what they're looking at. Ask your grandparents about cassettes. So I actually started my oral history career on cassettes. That tells you how old I am now. We used to watch this little wheel, see how thin it was getting to determine how much time we had left in the interview. It was barbaric, I tell you. I'm glad those days are behind us. If it's an object, it may be video, it could be audio. A lot of our collection started on reel-to-reel recorders. We're still in the process of digitizing all our reels. We finished digitizing our cassettes years ago. The analog world presented all sorts of challenges for us with regard to formats. I know this is my favorite image that I'll share with you all day. Okay? We used to put data on these things, kids. You don't understand what these things are. Some of the older folks in the room still have some of these in their drawer in their desk. And I don't know, you could use it as a coaster. I'm not sure what you're going to use it as now. Okay? But analog definitely had its issues. This is some reel-to-reel tape that had to be destroyed. Digital has issues as well, and we'll talk about that as we go forward. So I don't even have to tell you when this happened, because the fashion dates when that picture was taken. Okay, let's talk about definitions first, just to establish what we're talking about when we're talking about oral history. Oral history, first off, if there are 4 basic elements to it, the first is it's first person. So we're dealing with people that have had first person experience of events. That's why oral history and working with memory are combined forever, because we're always working within living memory. The World War I Oral History Project is over. The World War II Oral History Project is drawing to a close. We're always working within living memory if we think about that. And so the functions and the processes of memory are always continually fascinating to oral historians because we're figuring out the ways to work with human memory. And human memory is tremendous, and it's also fallible. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. Oral history is also guided, and so those of you that are interested in interviewing, that's your role in the process. It's a guided exercise. I've listened to some unguided recordings, and I would say they're not oral history. They're reminiscences, or they're sometimes gossip or chit-chat, but they're not oral history. How it's guided is extremely important. It is a co-created source, and so the guide cannot be removed out of what's created. It's a unique event that's created between 2 people. It's recorded, and as I said, that's meant different things at different times. Oral history, even as a movement, began with the ability that we could start recording things. It's always been very tied to technology. It began with wire recorders back in the 30s and 40s and doing wire recording. One of my favorite pictures in our archive is them standing next to their new portable reel-to-reel recorder in the 70s. It looks like a mini fridge. But they were so happy. They were so happy that they could take that out in the field and do field work. It's amazing now what I can take out and do field work and produce a broadcast quality recording with a small device with an extremely low error rate. And I can also make as many copies of it as I want, and there's no loss. Oral historians used to sit around and argue about whether we should rewind the original cassette. Isn't that an exciting conversation? Okay. Now I can produce 1,000 copies that have the same quality, which is really a radical change. So how do we record? Do we do audio or video? And we'll talk about that later. That's a consideration that we have to make in projects. Oral history is also preserved, and the archivists in the room know that challenge of preserving it, but also making it accessible. How do we do that is something that oral historians are working. When I partner with those scholars I showed you earlier, they're doing something new in their research. Not only using oral history, which is new, they're creating a collection. They're creating a publicly accessible collection when they do with their research. Some of them have never done anything like that before. They've just researched for their own project and then they move on. So I talk to them about what does it mean to create a collection. So oral history is all these things. So goals we can talk about broadly, and this is kind of a map for today, what we're going to go through quickly. Creating oral history, interviewing and recording. Preserving oral history, protecting it, making it useful and archiving it, and then sharing our oral history, giving it back, making it accessible, and publicizing oral history. I talked about oral history's ties to technology. The digital age has opened up all sorts of possibilities with oral history. Traditional history hasn't changed tremendously with the digital age. Oral history has changed dramatically with the digital age. In fact, in many ways, the orality has returned to oral history. The visual elements have returned to oral history. I always pick on Columbia. Columbia University had the first oral history program. I like to pick on them because they're well funded and their collection's bigger than mine. Used to, they would do recordings, and once they got it in a transcript form, they would destroy or reuse the original recording. Okay? And there's several reasons why they would do that. One, we have kind of a text fetish in our culture. We like text more than oral sources. 2, they knew how to take care of paper. Okay, and taking care of these other things is more challenging. Presents a lot of challenges, and we'll talk about that as we go forward. So, creating, preserving, sharing are all elements of what I do and what oral historians do. Okay, I spent a long time coming up with these icons. Google image search. Okay, so let's talk first about, you're going to understand what it is here in a minute. What are some weaknesses? See, weaknesses? See, it's got a weak. This didn't just happen, people. I drove a long way. I had to put this together in the car. Okay. So what are some weaknesses in oral history? Yes?
The constant changing of recording. So if you record on a CD, then
But if you record on a CD, then the new technology will change and that becomes obsolete. And then you have a problem with being able to read that data because the machines that read them aren't being produced anymore.
It sounds like your heart's been broken before. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I'm sorry I didn't mention it earlier when we were asking questions, but right now I'm interning at the McElhenney Archives, and they are constantly taking oral histories from salt miners on the island, families that have worked on Avery Island for generations. So in the archives we have DVDs, we have cassettes, we have all of these different technologies that have evolved, and it's kind of how do you keep up with maintaining the oral history of oral history as the technology keeps developing.
That's good. Yeah, so definitely as a weakness as a source or an object would be that issue of trying to keep it, because at one point you got it on CDs and you thought you were good. At one point you got it on mini disc and you thought you were good. I remember when I started working, this firm advertised the Millenniata, which was the 1,000-year CD. I thought that's a great marketing plan. You know, they're out of business now, but they did sell people, 1,000 years later, come get your money back if it didn't work. Okay, CDs actually were going to be the promise, the indestructible promise, and actually cassettes proved much more faithful than CDs did in keeping audio. Okay, so yeah, that is a challenge. Other weaknesses?
selective memories.
Very selective memories, right? We're all prone to triumphalism in our life. We don't necessarily, particularly with crisis, it's a challenge because we want to tell you how we learned something from it. Okay, and then I learned this from it and I got better. Right? We do that in our own narrative because that allows us to cope with these things in a lot of ways. But oftentimes we're trying to understand that moment of crisis. We're trying to understand the texture of that moment of crisis, and so selectivity, okay, can be a big issue. One of the interviews, 2 projects I'll probably talk about a lot. One, I did interviews with genocide survivors that now live in Texas. And I was interviewing a gentleman in Houston who was a survivor of the Cambodian genocide. Sat down, turned on the recording. He told me his whole story in 11 minutes. I went back and timed it. It was 11 minutes. He told me his whole story. We spent an hour and 45 minutes in the interview. So I then went back. I'm taking notes the whole time of things I want to follow up and come back to. But it was important for him to have the whole arc out there, right? I can tell the whole arc of the story and I can get to now. To slow down and have to go through everything slowly would have been more challenging for him right off the bat. But he was willing with me to go back and go through things more slowly, but there is that push to want to get to the conclusion, right? And I think we all do that. Someone was asking me, I had a filmmaker I was working with. We had a very infamous lynching in Waco. And he asked me the question, what did Waco learn from this? Just that idea that if it's something horrible, maybe we learn something from it. That's not we do that, I know, to ourselves, but that's not necessarily always the case. That's a bad assumption to make, that this horrible thing happened, but we did all learn this from it. So I think there is a selectivity there. There's a triumphalism. Any other weaknesses you could think of? Yeah.
Forming a relationship with the interviewee.
Yeah. There's a great article by Valerie Yao that's called "What If I Like Them Too Much?" Okay, because, and I even noticed this myself. In fact, someone called me on it. I don't know why I'm telling you this story, but I did did interviews with concentration camp liberators. These are servicemen in Texas that opened up concentration camps in the spring of '45, and I was doing a presentation at a Jewish center and I kept calling them my liberators, because I had a relationship with these guys. I felt invested in their life. We had this sort of relationship because we'd worked together and create this thing. And a woman came up afterwards, and obviously she had some issues with me using that sort of terminology. But that sort of relationship is created you know, when you do an interview, because it is, them sharing their stories is one of the most intimate things that they can do with you. So it does create this bond and this relationship. Other weaknesses? So that could be a weakness, that could also be a strength, yeah.
So something that I worry about is because I usually find other people to interview by asking the people I'm interviewing if they know other people who know information, that it might create like an echo chamber of just interviewing one social group.
That's good. Yeah, and so a lot of that we need to address. We'll talk about project design a little bit. A lot of that we need to address in project design. A snowball method, which is what that is, can be good, but it could also be dangerous because it takes us down the road of just one perspective on events. Okay, strengths. See, it's a barbell, so it's for strengths. Some strengths, oral history. Well, while you're thinking, I'll give you some more weaknesses. It's selective, it's biased, there's forgetting, there's misremembering, there's lying. There's all these things that can happen in an oral history interview. It can be anecdotal. I would argue all the weaknesses that I just mentioned is in all our source material. Sometimes it's a little more glaring in oral history, but if you want to say that a census record is not biased or a census record is not selective, that it's more objective than an oral history, we could have an argument, because I would argue there's tremendous challenges with some of those. So, you know, as we design a project here in a minute, we need to think about how do we leverage those weaknesses and address them with the way we design our project, because we want to go towards the strengths. And the strengths are what? Yes.
I was going to say.
If you've got the mic, you don't have to raise your hand. You just talk.
I was going to say, like, you get a personal and maybe like emotional perspective of the story.
Yeah. Okay. Kind of get the human experience of it, right? Nothing less human than looking at a birth certificate, right? I mean, it's a great source, but it's not very human. Yes?
They're very helpful for microhistory, so people that aren't in the documents enough.
Extremely helpful. I did a presentation last week to a group that's studying African history. If you want to do a modern people's history of Africa, you can only use oral history. There's not, I mean, there are other source materials available, but it's not in the colonial record. So if you want to do oral history, if you want to do that sort of history, particularly cultural, social, you've got to use oral history. Other strengths? Okay, I'll give you some other ones. I feel like it brings texture to events. It brings not only narratives, but counter-narratives. I love it when I think I'm an expert and someone shares with me an experience that doesn't fit with any sort of framework I have historically. I love that. I love that because it's the way history is lived. I mean, what got me excited about oral history is just the variety of ways in which the same historical event can impact people dramatically differently. Okay, you know, there is, and this is the challenge of it, there is no the history. There are many histories. And so, and the way individuals experience those events, I find endlessly fascinating. Okay, at the way in which some large events that I think about as a historian intersect with individual families and individual experience. Okay. All right. Okay, so we're going to talk about oral history and crisis a little bit. This is the national flag of Louisiana. The blue tarp on the roof. But this is my house in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. So they were asking me earlier, how did I get involved with crisis oral history? Well, I was in Hattiesburg in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit Mississippi. And so I co-directed the Center for Oral History and Cultural Heritage at the University of Southern Mississippi. And so we were doing interviews on the Mississippi side about Hurricane Katrina. And folks on the Mississippi side were eager to participate in oral history because they felt like it had become a New Orleans narrative, and oral history offered them a way for their voice and their experience to be part of the record. And this is a little sad because this is my daughter that's graduating high school next week, and that's my son I just realized, so I'll be an empty nester in about 3 months, and I'm not quite sure how to process it. So I'm coming around to how to process it. So that got me involved in crisis oral history, and crisis oral history, as has been well established by this series, crises can take all sorts of forms. I did this book, Listening on the Edge, and I have this forthcoming book about oral history and the environment. This was about oral history and crises. And these are just some selected crises from these two books. And as Dr. Skilton has pointed out, some of these slow in coming, some of these quick in coming. Crisis can mean many different things. It could mean a shifting relationship between the Maori and geothermal fields in New Zealand. It can mean climate change in the Australian outback, shifting relationships with rural water systems in Puerto Rico. It could mean a variety of different things. It's not just 9/11, Rwanda, Hurricane Katrina. It is those things. It is those things. But oftentimes, some of these slower forming go unnoticed, and they go unattended to. Okay? And so I think if we're thinking about what is a crisis, we've got to think creatively. And one of the arguments I make in the book is I think oral history is at its best when it's looking at these crisis points. Maybe they're just in an individual life, or these tension points that exist in an individual life, an individual community, perhaps even in a society. Where do those tensions lie, and how can we understand them better? How can we use oral history to understand them better?
Okay. So you were talking about like the tensions with oral history. Well, I know like at the NCPH conference this past year, they had like a workshop on gun violence and like how to react afterwards. So it was a lot like this archives in crisis sort of thing.
Yeah.
And they wanted to collect oral histories, but then something we all debated about, and we never actually came to an answer. Like, how long should you wait after a disaster? I mean, I know disasters are of different levels, but like, how long should you wait before trying to reach out to people to like collect these stories?
That's a great question. I think there's no standard. So when we started doing interviews after Hurricane Katrina, we faced some criticism for doing oral history that quickly because the feeling was if journalists are doing it, you shouldn't be doing it. My argument was it's very useful for someone thinking historically, particularly if you're in the community. If it's your community and part of your mission is to serve your community, that's what I felt like in Mississippi, how could we not be engaged in this process? So my argument was we're going to do interviews now with those that are ready to talk now, and I'll talk a little bit in a minute about assessing readiness, but we'll do interviews later if they're ready to talk then, okay? So I think there's tremendous benefit. Even though there are people out there documenting, they have a very different set of concerns than you would have in an interview. And so I think there's great value in thinking long term what's useful as an archival source here. You know, some would say you're going into the field of journalism and doing that, but journalists have very different concerns than oral historians have. I'm trying to understand someone's experience from their own perspective, the way they want to present it. I'm not taking that to try to fit it within something that I've got an immediate deadline for. And also, one's a very long form exercise. One's a very segmented and directed exercise, okay? So I would say there's not a fixed rule on that. I was doing interviews within a month. The 9/11 Oral History Project faced some criticism with this. The way they got around it is they did a longitudinal study. So they said, we're going to interview people now, but we're also going to come back in 5 years and interview. So that's one thing they did kind of to address that in a research design. And they've completed a lot of those second interviews with people. That's a great question. Okay, let's talk a little bit about creating oral history projects, some things to think about in the creation end as we think about those concentric circles that we started out with. Thinking about what are we interested in, what's an angle that we can approach this from. It's not just about generating interview data. Okay, we've got to be intentional in thinking about what's the angle we're going to approach this on. How are we going to determine if we're successful in our project? There was a journalism professor at USM that approached me after Hurricane Katrina. He said, we're going to buy 1,000 recorders, and we're going to take them down to Gulfport, and we're going to distribute them. And then we're going to come back a few weeks later and collect all the recorders. It's like, I'm not doing that. You can go ahead and do that, okay? But you can think about all the problems with that approach. There's no training. We're just collecting things. And how's it going to be made useful? How's it going to make sense? Just turning on a recorder doesn't mean something good happens. A lot of preparation has to go into it. A lot of thought has to go into research design. So it's not just about collecting things, it's about collecting them well. And so we need to think, is oral history the appropriate method? If it is the appropriate method, how do we make it most appropriate? How do we use it in such a way that it leverages the strengths we were talking about earlier and addresses some of the weaknesses? A weakness is people don't remember dates very well. You don't remember dates very well. Your memory, surprisingly so, is actually very well phased. I was in high school. You don't remember if you were a sophomore or a junior, but you will remember you were in high school when it happened. And so I always say if a veteran tells me Pearl Harbor was bombed in 1983, I don't care because I know when Pearl Harbor was bombed, and I don't put that on my interviewee. I hold the timeline for him. I've done my research. If I ask him how did he feel, what did he think, he's just gotten a lot more accurate in how he's going to respond to me rather than I ask him was it 4 in the afternoon or 2 in the afternoon? So, you know, is it the appropriate method if I'm doing an economic history of, say, Hurricane Ike? Maybe it is, but maybe there's some other approaches that I need to use to get the data, to get some of the quantitative aspects of it, and allow oral history to rely on its qualitative strengths to gather that material for this project. How does it contribute to historical understanding? Does it bring new information in? Does it bring in fresh perspectives? How can we position our project to leverage oral history at its best and really benefit what's being gathered? Sometimes I ask students, where are the silences? How do we find the silences and where they exist? Can we use a project to address some of those silences? And how can we approach it? Isn't that cool? I don't know how that happened, but that's pretty cool, right? That was somewhere around sulfur. I figured out how to do that. Okay. So if we're prepping for a project, we do our research, we focus that project, and we refine our project. I would argue that a lot of oral history, community oral history, is done too broadly, and they haven't thought a lot about what are the ways in which that history of that community can reveal and add insight to certain phenomena or certain aspects. Okay? We can go and record life histories, but what are the things we can learn that's not just about an individual story, but is about a broader experience and a broader understanding? And so we research, we focus, and we refine our aim in a project. As we design our project, public historians know you got to do this. You got to start with what the end is. You know, what is the outcome, or what are possible outcomes here that we're interested in? That may come back and answer my audio or video question that I have, okay? Whether we do audio or video, and I'll talk about audio and video in a minute. Now, what does finished look like? I'm a big advocate for not giving 1,000 recorders out on the coast, okay? I'm a big advocate for phasing a project. Let's do 5 interviews and have a win, and then we'll go do more interviews. But how will we know when we're done? Okay, how do we define that? That's important in your project design. How are we going to track our progress? How are we going to know if we're doing well, if we're succeeding as a project? And who's responsible for what? And the answer may be you for everything, okay? But oral history by its definition is collaborative. So I'm always interested in asking the question, who can we collaborate with? Who would be interested in making sure these stories are gathered? Who would be interested in making sure these stories are preserved and shared? Asking that sort of question can be very useful. Perhaps they can come along as a partner on the project. Now you need to think through the dynamics of having them as a partner on the project, how that's going to play out with interviewees, but sometimes it can be tremendously beneficial, okay? But making clear who's going to do what, who's going to transcribe. Summer's going to do all the transcription. She knows how to do it. She was nodding a while ago when I said transcription's worth more than $3,000. Okay. If we think about oral history as an approach, here are the things that you're doing. You're creating history. You're creating a unique historical source. This is why I get excited about it. A lot of libraries have and a lot of archives have a lot of material. There's a lot of redundancy in archives. There's a lot of redundancy in libraries. In other words, now everybody has it, or everybody can get it. Particularly with the digital age, and my best friends at Baylor are in a library alone. Okay? If it exists, I can get it because a lot of people have it. With oral history, you're creating a unique primary source. It's one of a kind. And I can tell you, most people that I interview, of course, have never been interviewed before. So there's a value at a public level for me doing this. And there's also a value at a private level for them. It's an important thing for them to participate in. I would say a lot of the people I've interviewed, this is the only testament, particularly folks I began with early in my career. I've got the recording of them. Family never did it. No one ever documented it. And so these things have meaning over time. That's one of the reasons why I think of that private importance. That's one of the reasons why we want to do it well. We're there to learn. When I go out, I have information on the topic, but I'm interested in learning their experience. Okay? Not there to demonstrate what I know or to take them to my conclusions, but to gather their experience on their own terms. I think about this issue, particularly in an archival sense. What are people going to be interested in going forward? Okay. 25 years, 50 years, 75 years. What will be of interest here? What will be of importance here? And how to have a conversation that way. When I'm designing a project, I think about insider-outsider issues and if that matters or not. Okay. And this was about Lake Charles, about the Lake Charles turnoff. I figured this out. Okay, insider, outsider. So let's give you an example. Insider project. I'm doing my family. I'm doing a family oral history. I'm the ultimate insider, doing an oral history project with my family. What are some advantages of that? Whoever has the mic. You're the default setting for the mic.
Yeah.
All right. So what are some advantages?
Well, I guess acting as an insider, you automatically know who you're talking to and you have a basic knowledge of whatever aspect of the family history you're asking about. Because I know I have done a few oral family histories and my family is Cajun. And I was going to mention this earlier when you were saying pros and cons. I know with the WPA in the 1930s, when they recorded African Americans, they transcribed it using the dialect. And so I know whenever I was talking to my family, we would switch between English and French very frequently. And if any other person was listening to our recordings, they most likely would not understand.
Yeah. And so that the Slave Narrative Project, which is Federal Writers Project in the 30s, really interesting project. We don't do that anymore. Oral historians don't do that. I mean, they're trying to transcribe dialect. You know, I'm so glad we don't do that. You know, did that y'all have 4 A's in it or 7 A's in it? You know, that we don't have to sit around and try to have those conversations. But yeah, it's challenging. But you're right. You have context, right? You've got all the information around the information. Any other advantages of an insider?
If you have a personal connection, people might be more upfront with information as opposed to wanting to hold back on things that they might think will either make them look bad or have a negative impact.
Yeah, there may be more trust. There may be more rapport there that might be in place. I will say I'm always interested as an outsider what people will tell me that they don't tell people in the family. Because I'm neutral, right? They've got to eat Thanksgiving dinner with you. I'm going to be back in Waco, you know. And so I think it can cut both ways, but there should be some sort of rapport and trust built up. Access, you know, not only knowing that information, but also having access to the information around that information. Those are advantages. Disadvantages?
Well, because
This
they're
is when family dynamics start to come out.
yeah, well, because they're your family, they don't want to talk about it. They want to keep it
Yeah.
hidden. Like in my family, they like one of my great uncles like worked for Huey Long, and so my family doesn't want to talk about him working with Huey Long. Like, no, we brush that under the rug. So it's stuff like that.
Yeah, but they may talk to me about it. I
Maybe.
mean, if I came in and if I pressed them, they might talk to me about it. Which is kinda-
Maybe.
maybe, yeah. Any other disadvantages?
So again, working with my family when I've done a few oral histories, I found that it's a bit harder to stay professional because it is family.
Yeah.
I noticed that we would go off on tangents and we'd just goof off, and whenever I would listen to it again, I was like, oh, I can't even use this. It's just total nonsense.
Yeah, so I can say this since I'm from Baylor. Scripture says you can't be a prophet in your hometown. You know, just that idea. They changed your diaper, right? So, you know, how are you going to press them to answer this sort of question? You have a different relationship with them. That's one of the disadvantages. Kind of your positionality can be challenging. Being objective can be extremely challenging. You know, if you're a tree in the middle of the forest, it's kind of hard to step back and see the whole forest. To ask these sort of objective questions that historians would be interested about your family, about phenomena within your family and their experience. My favorite interview I ever did is with my dad, who's passed. And I know when he says any word, what he means by the way he's saying that word. So what do you mean by that? I know all the layers of meaning connected to how he's responding to me in an interview. And a regular interviewer wouldn't necessarily have that sort of sensitivity to what's going on with it. A big disadvantage of insider projects, and we have to think about this as archivists, and we think about accessibility later on, is insiders are prone to insider speak. Okay? So I went over to, I didn't know I was going to share this story. This is how, I kind of have a stream of consciousness thing. I went to the history building today. Okay? Had a tour of the history building. The history building has the worst signage of any building I have ever seen on the planet. Okay? So it is not designed for outsiders. So I didn't know what floor the history department on, where somebody's office was in the history department on. Tried to use the elevator for a while. I didn't have a magic, I couldn't use some bathrooms. So, you know, there was all sort of insider information that I needed to operate that space. I came as an outsider and I didn't know how to function there, okay? Insiders are prone to having sort of insider knowledge that they keep to themselves. Now, if we're an archivist, everyone that's going to use this interview is an outsider. Okay? If we're going to place it in an archive and we're going to make it accessible and we're going to preserve it, we want it to be done in a way that it's useful for outsiders. And so we can have a very closed conversation in an interview, or we can open it up where others can take part in listening to that and really understanding and having access to what's going on. So if I'm in an insider relationship with someone in an interview, I'll say something like, there's a third person in the room, and this is a future student that's going to listen to this interview. So I'm going to ask you questions you know I know the answer to, but we're having this conversation so they can come to it and they can understand it and they can learn things from it. It also offers the opportunity to examine things that are never examined. Okay, and I'll make my point this way. The staff is getting me tired of making my point this way, but I like this analogy. Raise your hand if you've used a rotary phone before. Okay, there's an age divide a little bit here, but a lot of you have used a rotary phone. Okay, so if I do that in 20 years, how many of you, well, some of you will still be around. Let's say 40 years, 50 years. I'm sorry to remind you of your own mortality so early in the afternoon. But just this idea, I don't think there's anybody anywhere on a recording talking about how a rotary phone worked, because it's so ordinary and commonplace and everyday that why would you talk about something like that in an interview? But I would argue 50 years, 75 years from now, that'll be complete lost knowledge, even though 100% of the population had that experience. but it's an unexamined, unexplored aspect of being that is there. And so I challenge people who are designing a project at times, okay, what's the rotary phone here? You know, what is the thing that needs to be broken down and explained in this interview that would be really useful to have on this recording and really insightful to have on this recording, okay? Yeah, I just remember when you dialed 0, you had to wait. You had to wait for like 0 to go all the way around. So again, caveman sort of stuff. So we can think all these advantages, disadvantages. I'm from a small town in East Texas, and my wife would go home. I knew none of the street names in the town I grew up in. I'm not an idiot. I have a PhD, but I didn't know the names of the streets because I had a higher level of meaning than street names. Go to where the high school burned down and take a left. Go to where the Hardee's used to be and take a right. To an outsider, that's extremely useless. She wanted Google directions. She wanted turn-by-turn navigation to get there. So I had to talk in such a way that it was accessible to an outsider. Outsiders can have advantages of objectivity, okay? They can have advantages of asking harder questions than insiders would be willing to ask. Outsiders have all these disadvantages. These are kind of flipped. Establishing rapport and trust, gathering context, all these sorts of challenges. Okay? So we want to think about how to leverage both of these advantages. If we're an insider, think about those advantages an outsider has. How can I position my project in such a way that I can take advantage of those? If I am an outsider, how do I establish rapport, trust, gather context, build relationships, all the things that are advantageous to an insider to have, okay? At the same time, staying away from these disadvantages that both possess. Now, as we pick narrators, we want those that have firsthand experience. That's very important, as we said, in that definitional aspect of oral history. We want narrators who are representative of a range of people related to a topic. And we really want diverse perspectives on a topic. We really want a pool of interviewees. Again, it's not just about how many. It's about who. Okay? It's about that variety of interviewees. It's not just, because I can do 50 interviews or I could do 20 interviews, and 20 gives me a much broader representation around a topic than the 50 does. Okay? When I think of a project, I think of a table. Okay, my project I'm designing is a table, and I only have so many chairs I can pull up to that table. So who am I going to invite, okay, to sit at this table with me? I know as an interviewer, every interview I do, I'm choosing not to do thousands of it. There's only so many of these things I can do, right? So I need to think intentionally about who's coming to the table. This is why I'm not an advocate of putting an ad in the paper. I'm not as big an advocate of snowball selecting who gets to be interviewed. You know, I want to think about that strategically. This is what I think about now when I think about who do I invite to the table. Can anyone tell me what this is? What is it?
Potpourri.
No, it's not potpourri. It kind of looks like that. Sir, you know what this is. What is that? Cornucopia. It is kind of a cornucopia. Okay. So my in-laws have this cabin in the woods in East Texas. And to call it a cabin is really understating it. But I go there sometimes to write. Last time I was there writing, this is sitting in the middle of the table. And I became interested in this thing. I wish I had something to say. Oh, there's my computer. So you can get to scale how big this stinking thing is. Okay? So this sits in the middle of the table. It's the centerpiece of the table, right? And so anytime you want to sit down to eat, I think you need 2 people at a time. You have to lift this thing off and go, and there's a place it lives when it's not on the table, kind of under the stairs, away from everyone. It's a ridiculously large centerpiece. If my mother-in-law ever sees that I use this, she's going to be upset. But I'm not quite sure what this thing is, but I can only look at it from one perspective. I can only look at it from one perspective. And so if I really want to understand what this thing is, this weird, antlered, gourded, potpourri-looking basket it looks interplanetary. It reminds me of the opening scene of Aliens. But anyway, if I want to understand what this thing is fully, I need someone on the other side of this to explain what they see. And I need someone over on the other side of this to explain from their angle what they see. Okay? And so if I can get enough perspectives around this thing, we can start to get a full idea of what this thing is. Now, the challenge with a lot of oral history projects is we invite people from the same perspective over and over and over again, or we have three perspectives. I was reading about a community oral history project the other day, and later on they realized they should have interviewed people that left the community, right? I mean, just the idea that that was a big gap in who they had interviewed. In Mississippi at USM, we have a great civil rights collection. Probably the most important part of our collection is the collection we did with the Klan in the 20s and 30s. Because, again, we're not celebrating that story, but we're trying to understand all perspectives around this thing. And there are things that are over-documented and there are things that are under-documented. Oral historians tend to think at times we can only interview people that we want to celebrate, but I'm trying to understand things. I'm not trying to celebrate things, okay? So how do we get a variety of perspectives? And so sometimes you've got to think creatively about that. And earlier when I talked about approach, perhaps we can think about documenting crises. What's the aspect here that no one's documenting? Who's getting attention, who's not getting attention, okay? One of the chapters in the forthcoming book is a friend at the Historic New Orleans Collection that wrote wrote a chapter on pelican rescue after Hurricane Katrina, after the BP oil spill. And pelicans were getting a lot of attention, but there was a lot of wildlife that was not getting much attention at all. Okay, and so there's one story here, but there are also a variety of perspectives and a variety of stories that need to be captured. How do we do that? Okay, so if my mother-in-law sees this once, I'll have to remove it from my slideshow. But anyway, I was glad it was useful. I didn't get much writing done that day, but I just meditated on this centerpiece. Okay. As we do our research, we come up with our research questions. We come up with the things that we're interested in discovering in our interviews. As we begin to prepare for individual interviews, we develop an interview outline that we want to use for the interview. Okay? Now, what's very important is we don't develop a question list. I go out with a lot of community oral history projects and they say, okay, let's start on the questions. Whoa. Okay, we don't develop a question list. I'll tell you later why we don't develop a question list, but that's really important. But we do have an idea of topics that we're very interested in exploring in the interview. And this is going to offer a framework for you as you conduct this interview. We want to be prepared. We've done our research. That's going to help us make some good connections during the interview itself. But we're going to be flexible as well. So we can think about this as a closed hand. We've got our research. We've done our due diligence. We've got our background here. But I've got an open hand as well. And I'm going to be flexible in what comes in the interview. I'm going to be weighing if it's something that needs to be explored or further investigated. Okay? One of the problems with the question set is it's two closed hands. I'm going to begin at question 1. I'm going to end at question 10. In the middle, I'll be at question 5. Okay? And we don't want that. I want you to have some flexibility with in the interview, because I'll tell you, the best thing from the interview often is the thing that you didn't expect to get. And so one of the challenges here, the question list assumes you already know the questions you need to ask, and that's problematic, a problematic assumption. Okay, so as we go into the project, we've got to make this decision, audio versus video. This is a audio recorded interview. This is me. I'm going to show you a clip of Mr. Chang's interview here in a minute. This is a video recorded interview. This is pensive look number 4. I have a series of pensive looks, but that's pensive look number 4. My doctor says I can't do that anymore because of a recurrent neck problem. But anyway, those are kind of what the setup looks like, and get a sense of what the setup looks like for both. Video's a little bit more what? What do you notice initially from the pictures? A little bit more invasive, a little bit more complicated. It's we're moving furniture around. Okay, here they're plopping a recorder down on a table. Here I'm setting up lights. I'm setting up a recorder. I'm setting up a backup audio recorder. I'm setting up a separate microphone. So it's a little more involved. So you can think about that on your project. With video, I think about what sort of data on the video am I gathering at 30 minutes in. If it's a dude and his lazy boy, at 5 minutes in, I've gathered all I'm going to gather. Okay? But if there's something interesting going on, if there's something visually, if I'm interviewing quilters, perhaps how could I not do video? Okay? So we need to think through that. Now, my outcome may already determine I need video. Okay? But we can weigh those sorts of things. This is an interview in an office. This is someone on our staff. I hate doing interviews in offices. It's my least favorite place to do interviews. Why do you think it's my least favorite place to do interviews? It is impersonal. It's more comfortable for them. I know by definition that I am not their top priority if I'm sitting in their office. I know by definition that they're thinking of other things. I like to even know if they've got to do something later that day. I'll do an interview with you, and then I'm giving the keynote address at so-and-so, so-and-so. Okay, well, maybe maybe they don't have space really to give full attention to what I want to do. I know by people are going to knock on that door, that phone's going to ring. I don't have their full attention. I love living rooms. Actually, more than living rooms, I like dens, because nobody ever goes in the living room. I like dens. I like sitting around all the things that people have to store their memories for them. The photographs, the objects, the artifacts. I like them sitting in the middle of that stuff. And I like it when they've got space for me to do the interview. I went to interview the mayor of Biloxi after Hurricane Katrina, and he gave me 15 minutes for the interview. And so we spent the 15 minutes looking at his calendar to figure out when we could get a longer period of time that I could drive back down to the coast and do the interview. Okay. Audio video, is it required? What's the impact? Thinking about that, thinking about our project design, which one do we want to do? Video, by definition, as you can see from this, is a team to do well. Okay? In other words, you need two people at least to do video well. With audio, I can do it on my own. Okay? A little more training for video to do well. My audio orientation is very short. A good video orientation is a little more involved. Okay? I'm telling you this because every layperson automatically thinks, you can do video, why wouldn't you do video? I can do it on my phone. First off, don't do any of this on your phone. Okay? But you've got to think through these things planning a project. Storage footprint, audio per audio hour is a gigabyte or less. Video hour is about 15-30 gigabytes per hour. Storage is less of a concern than it used to be. In fact, in 2003, when I got my PhD, oh, we're not celebrating that anymore? Anyway, okay. I'm just kidding. Please. In 2003, when I got my PhD and went to the USM, we started to digitize stuff, and I called the libraries. I called the tech guy in the library. This is the tech guy in the library. And I said, I need some server space because we're going to start digitizing our audio. And he goes, how much do you need? I said, 1 terabyte. He said, a what? This was the tech guy in the library. Okay, he's supposed to know what 1 terabyte is by 2003. Now I can get 1 terabyte external storage drive for $50, $75 down at Best Buy. So memory is less of an issue than it used to be, but you are dealing with some larger files with audio. Now, anything else you want to remark on this setup? You're going to see the video here in a minute, what it actually looks like on camera. Notice anything there? I'm off camera. Yep, I'm off camera. So we don't have a 2-camera setup. I've got a 1-camera setup that's focused on Mr. Chang. It looks like it's a little overlit, right? Okay, that's really how you want it with video. Most amateur video is dramatically underlit. Okay, so having light is important. Anything else? But like we're moving couches and moving tables. Luckily, everyone's living room has divots where the furniture goes, so it's all there to tell you where to put it back at the end. Okay, but it is a bit more invasive. So we think about location a lot. We want a good recording location. We want something that's convenient to them. We want something that's free of interruptions, distractions, and background noise. Okay, I'm always thinking about are there some simple things I could do to make this a better recording environment? Because their den is a lousy recording environment. Okay, your ear tunes out things. It's tuned out the AC that's making a lot of noise in this room, but your ear has tuned it out. The recorder will not tune it out. Can you hear it now? Now that I pointed out, you can hear it now. And so we've got to think about, are there some things that we can do to address that? I have all sorts of funny stories of noises on recordings. Can I tell you one? I'll tell you two, because my English teacher said you couldn't have an A without a B, right? So I've got to tell you two. The first one is in Mississippi. These are 2 Mississippi interviews. Notice how I say that right. I have an undergraduate student that's going to Mississippi for going to Starkville to study in the fall, and I said, "How do you pronounce M-I-S-S-I-P-P-I?" And he says, "Mississippi?" I said, "No." So I taught him how to say Mississippi. 2 interviews in that collection in Mississippi. One is they had the microphone sitting near the window unit. And so when it gets warmer than 77 degrees in that room, you can't hear anything on the recording. And then the room will cool off, and then you can hear stuff again. The other one that I shouldn't tell you, but I'm going to anyway, it was an interview in a doctor's office. And obviously behind the doctor's office on the other side of the wall was a restroom. It was a man, and it sounded like a tall man came in at some point to relieve himself during the interview. So you hear this water running, this kind of ambient water running sound in the background, okay? And eventually they just stop talking, and so you can hear it really clearly. And then the interviewer goes, "Oh, we'll take that out when we get it back to the office." And that was like in 1976. It's still on the recording, okay? Because we want as clean a recording as we create. We don't know how we're going to use it, right? As public historians, we know this, right? It could be one thing now. It could be a radio program. It could be a podcast. Who knows what it could be later? And so we want as clean a recording as possible. Now, there are things we can do to clean it up after the fact, but any cleaning up we do on that audio is going to affect some quality of the human voice. We can't delete a gentleman relieving himself. There's not a button for that in Audacity, okay? So we can reduce that sound, but again, we're trying to create as clean a recording as we can. So I think about this when I walk in. I think about dogs, I think about babies, I think about phones ringing. I think the postman's going to show up. That clock looks like a bird's going to come out of it every 30 minutes. Okay, I think about those sorts of things as I go into an interview. Okay, are there some little things that we can do to make it less likely that they're going to be interrupted and it's not going to mess up my audio? Okay, and there can be some simple things that you can do. So this is a conference room. That's our conference room. So I can bring them to the conference room, but that's going to change it a little bit too. Right? If they're sitting in my conference room. I mean, when I do interviews, I'm thinking about, do I go dressed like this, or do I wear a t-shirt? Even language I use, do I say anecdote, or do I say story? That you educated people may think I just said the same thing, but I didn't. You know, language can become a barrier in an interview. Okay, so we want accessible language. I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, the Oral History Association now recommends a pre-interview. So the sit down and the discussion before the interview. Not all project designs will accommodate this, but a pre-interview can be very helpful. We can do several things. First off, this isn't recorded. This is just you sitting them down. Perhaps it's an opportunity to go over the agreement form. That's one of the required forms that you're going to have with oral history. And so perhaps we can talk about that. Particularly if you think that might be an issue, I would go ahead and talk about it in the pre-interview. Perhaps we can discuss potential topics. My students, when they do a project, develop a project-based data form. So it's a project, particular to that project, a data form that they use for the project. So it's gathering things like, I've got a student right now that's doing a oral history project on whiskey makers in Texas. There's an emergent whiskey industry in Texas. And so on that data form, it's got some things about education, it's got things about jobs, it's got other things that they're gathering that aren't going to be part of the interview, but they're very useful to gather on this data form that he can then take back and use it to research a little bit more. If they're a veteran, they can tell me what service medals they received or what units they were assigned to. I can take that with me and do a little research, and then when I come to the interview, I'm a little better prepared. Okay? So this form can offer us a way to gather some quantitative data that helps me ask better questions to get the qualitative data. I may ask about photos, scrapbooks, other things they would suggest I take a look at before I come back to visit with them. I can give you plenty of examples of bad interviews I did. I did an interview with a guy named Bill Bailey in Mississippi. At the end of the interview, he gave me his book, which was called, he's a veteran. What was his book called? Come on. I don't suspect the younger people to get this. Once You Come Home, Bill Bailey. His name was Bill Bailey. So, and I figured out, I got the book after the interview, and as I listened to the interview and read the book, I had an audio version of the book. Okay? I sure wish I'd had the book ahead of time, but I didn't ask for it. And then I could have been better informed to ask and reveal other things than Bill Bailey had put in his book. Photos, scrapbooks, any other research material. I want to set up an appointment for the interview that's convenient to them, something that might work. In general, oral history interviews are an hour to an hour and a half. Again, it's hard to make a firm rule on that. The 100-year-old woman I interviewed in Columbus, Mississippi, at 4 hours I said, "Can we go get something to eat?" And she was still going. Okay. Even though it may take an hour to hour and a half, I would ask for a 2-hour block just to have a little flexibility at that appointment time. I will always say that two 1.5-hour interviews are better than 1 3-hour interview, right? So we can talk about coming back at some point, and then that gives you an opportunity to prepare. You said this in the first interview, I learned this, can you answer that? That sort of thing, okay? We need to scope out the territory. We need to figure out what our recording environment's going to be like, what our relational environment might be like with the interview. And so is a spouse going to sit in? Is a child going to sit in? And people ask me, is that good or bad? And the answer is yes. Sometimes it can be very beneficial. I just interviewed a 99-and-a-half-year-old. I figured out at 99 you start adding it's like an infant. You add the months in again. A 99-and-a-half-year-old and his daughter was in the room, and it was very helpful to have her in the room. It could be detrimental. I've also interviewed folks where a daughter was in the room and I could tell they began to censor at some point what they were sharing with me. Okay? And so you need to scope out that territory. You also, with difficult topics, need to assess readiness, and this is something we were talking about earlier. Are they ready to tell their story? And that, believe it or not, that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the passage of time. So it may have occurred 50 years ago and they're not ready to tell their story. But you're getting a little bit of their relationship to their story. Before you're actually getting the story itself, you're getting a little bit of their relationship to their story. The Veterans History Project, which is the world's largest oral history project, it's like 100,000 interviews at the Library of Congress, recently made a change in how they're collecting interviews. They changed, now they collect interviews from Gold Star families. So they used to interview veterans. Now they're going to interview the families of veterans that lost someone. Okay, Gold Star families are those that lost someone during a conflict. So the person I know at Veterans History Project, I said, you better be ready. These are very different stories, right? Because if you're interviewing a World War II vet that went to World War II and then lived 50 more years and then got interviewed, it's very different than interviewing someone about a life that stopped in South Vietnam in 1967. You know, there's not the after. You know, there's not the broader life lived. Okay. And so just that I was concerned that they wouldn't take this step of really assessing people's readiness to tell their story, because I think that's very important to understand that relationship. If they're telling their story for the first time, it's going to be more challenging to them. It's a different exercise to relate to you a memory than it is to re-experience something. To go back and re-experience something rather than tell you what I've remembered before about an event. You can see how those are different. Okay, in a practical sense, things you need with you. You need your interview outline. Now, some of you are people who, you're like my wife, who you have to have a list of things. So, like and this tells you if this is the sort of person, if you've ever written down something you already did just so you can cross it off, and it kind of releases endorphins at the base of your brain and makes you feel better about yourself. So some of you will want scriptedness to your interviews. I will let you script 2 or 3 questions in your interview. You can have 2 or 3 questions that you want to set up and script in your interview. Now, from a project design standpoint, that can be useful because perhaps we want to look at everybody, we're creating a controlled environment where everyone responds to this question that's asked the same way across the range of all the interviews. Okay, so you could build that in to your project design if you want to. So we could have our outline that has our topics and maybe some scripted questions on it. We've got our recording equipment. Test the equipment. Experiment with the equipment, make sure you're comfortable with the equipment. They can become a real distraction during the interview. Okay, so you want to be very comfortable with it. Oftentimes I've made interviewees forget an audio recorders in the room. I've never made them forget a video recorders in the room. Okay, and I'm not trying to make them forget it, but I want to put them at ease. I want something to keep my time. I usually want that accessible to me because this does indicate something to your interviewee if you pull out your watch and look at your watch. Does that make sense? If you were talking to someone and they did this, that would tell you something. I want my necessary forms, my data form that I have for my project, and my deed of gift. So this can be a project-based data form. You're also going to want an interview data form that has their address, what you recorded it on, the date, all that sort of information. Metadata. Okay, all the metadata for the interview is going to be there. And extra batteries. We're going to plug in, and we're also going to have battery backup. Okay, so we're ready to go. We're going to hit the record button, and the first thing we're going to do is record an introduction. Okay? This is Dr Sloan. Today is May the, what's today? 10th? Okay, May 10th, 2019. I'm interviewing for the first time so-and-so, so-and-so, where it's taking place. My advice on this has changed over the years. Don't use a specific address, but I would use a general address, okay, for privacy purposes. I recognize my sponsoring agencies with the interview, and the title of this particular project. All that is up front at the beginning, okay? It's really important that you do this now because it won't happen another time on the recording, okay? In worst case, you'll end up with, we have a tape at Baylor called Interview with Grandma. I don't know who Grandma is. I don't know who the person interviewing Grandma is. It's a sweet recording, but I have no idea who these people are, okay? And so we want that label up front in the interview, okay? Early on, you're initiating the interview. You're spending some time connecting with the narrator. We're going to ask questions that are easy for them to field and handle early on in the interview. As you might imagine, most interviews follow kind of a life history narrative. In other words, if I'm interviewing someone about a crisis, I would not start with that crisis. I would start by gathering some background information, okay? You know, in the South, what's the first question you ask when you meet somebody? No, not yet. Where are you from? Okay, where are you from? Why do we ask that first? You know, other parts of the country, they don't ask that first. They ask, what do you do? Well, we feel like in the South, that gives us the most amount of information in the shortest amount of time, right? So you tell me you're from Lafayette? Oh, okay. Like I just downloaded some sort of information about you, okay? So we're asking questions about their early life with an eye toward whatever is key in our research. So if I'm interested in their graduate educational experience, I might ask them some questions early on that also include elements of their experience of education growing up with an eye toward what my core research questions are. Okay, does that make sense? If they speak slow, you speak slowly. That never happens to me. I have to speed up. There's two extremes here we want to avoid, and that's why I don't want your question list, because I don't want this to become a deposition. Nothing's less relational than a deposition. Where were you on the evening of? Okay. So we don't want this strict questionnaire over on the left. We also don't want chit-chat. As Summer can tell you, transcribing these things, we don't want hours and hours of people talking. Okay, you can assume something's good's gonna happen if that happens, but that's not necessarily the case. Okay, you could get 2 hours on the Trump administration when you were really interested in asking about, you know, diners in the 50s. Okay, if we don't, this is why the interviewer, it's important that the interviewer stay in control of the interview. Okay, you're shaping. They don't know what you want to know, so you're framing the area in which they're sharing their experience. Okay, so we don't want to be over here. We don't want to be over here. We want to be somewhere in the middle. Now, there will be people that cannot structure their story for themselves, that they won't stay on topic and they'll get off topic, and we try to put them here and they keep going over here. If that happens, we may have to slide this direction a little bit. Okay, we may have to give them a little more structure for their story. I've gone to the extent of writing one thing down on a piece of paper and saying, we're going to talk about this for the next 10 minutes. Okay, it's really important that we stay on topic. We've got a limited amount of time. I want to make sure I get these stories surrounding this. And I give them a little more structure for that to happen with them. Okay? Okay, so as they're talking, we're retaining control in there, letting them shape the story they're going to tell. It's really interactive interviewing. They are giving you things, you're listening, you're making notes on what they give you. You don't interrupt as they share, but you may be making points that you want to come back to or investigate a little further. If you're going to transcribe these things, you maybe even want to be making notes on spellings that you need to get clarified or place names that you need to get clarified, that sort of thing. I would have a different section on my notepad, and I would be making notes on that. Okay? They said gaucher. Okay, I need to figure out how you spell gaucher. Okay, I know how you spell gaucher, but I would make a note on that. That was the best part of Hurricane Katrina, if there were any good points, is listening to people from news networks try to pronounce some of the place names in southern Louisiana and southern Mississippi. Gaudier, past Christian. Anyway, that was entertaining to me. Okay, so we're listening. We're going to give them things back. We're actively listening. Now, I tell you this because generally you're very versed in passively listening. And if you can tell someone's passively listening to you if they're just waiting for you to stop talking so they can begin talking. Okay, I went to dinner with 2 colleagues the other night, and there was one of the colleagues' wives. Every story actually connected back to something related to her. Okay, so she was kind of waiting for there to be a pause, and then she had a story about whatever might be very loosely related to what we were talking about. Okay, you're very adept at passive listening. This is a survival skill. You can't actively listen to everyone that you're talking to, right? It would be exhausting to actively listen to every conversation. So you're kind of passively listening. You operate that way. But with oral history, to do it well, you really have to be actively listening. Not only what are they saying, but what is the meaning and what are they saying? How are they saying what they're saying? Did they really even answer the question I just asked them? Do I need to come back and make another pass at this question another way? You really have to be deeply, what are they suggesting by what they're saying? And so you're really listening at a level that you're not accustomed listening to. So don't try to do 4 of these in a day, because I can tell you it takes much more out of you than just listening to something. Okay. Okay. As we ask questions, we ask open-ended questions. Tell me how it was, describe in your own words. Historians are the worst because they tend to take things around called a thesis, and they're trying to get it proven with whoever they're interviewing. Okay. So we don't want to lead them to anything, right? Okay. We can ask them questions around our research topic, but we're not asking them to confirm any sort of conclusions that we've drawn. I would never say, was it this way or that way? I would never say, was it good or bad? I'm not trying to get answers on black and white. I'm trying to get all the colors of gray in between and what their experience was like, right? I don't want to qualify it for them. I don't want to assume it for them. Some people had wonderful stories to tell me of FEMA and Hurricane Katrina. That wasn't the national narrative on FEMA and Hurricane Katrina, okay? But I want to have room for those stories in these interviews because it wasn't the national narrative. It's important to have elements of counter-narrative in these interviews. And so you just have to be sure you're not leading them to any sort of certain thing, okay? They're talking. You're using your research to help frame responses for them, get them to responses. Again, we're asking straightforward questions in a very familiar language. I'm not using complicated words to put barriers between me and my interviewee. The right questions will address your research topic. So in our project design, we've thought about, well, really, what are we trying to, what are the most important things we're trying to gather here? And in our interview, we're going to think about different ways to approach that research topic or those research topics. Sometimes interviewers have a tendency to ask the most important question one time and ask, where were you born one time? Those questions are not created equal. So we need to think of a variety of ways that we can ask around our research topic, because sometimes it may be the second or third pass back by a topic that I'll get the full answer, or maybe the elaborated answer that I'm looking for. So this project I did with concentration camp liberators, some of these guys spent 1 hour in the spring of 1945 in a concentration camp. And I'm interviewing them in 2011 about that experience for an hour and a half. So I had to think of 4 or 5 different ways to get at their liberation experience. They walked me through the event. How did you talk to your kids about this event? Have you participated in memorializing this event? What is it like to be interviewed and recognized as this? Have you been to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington? So finding different avenues to kind of approach that and get back at it is important. Markers. Markers are, some oral historians call these signposts. They're going to pop up in the interview. You're either going to see them or you're not going to see them. They're going to say, my wedding wasn't like what I always thought it would be. And then they're going to keep going. And you're either going to say, uh-oh, maybe I should ask a question about how they thought their wedding would be. They're going to say, it was this way. And later on they're going to say, well, actually it was this way. Okay, why did they just loop back? Are they censoring something? Or are they really trying to get more accurate at something? Why is there confusion on that point? If this would seem to be the logical answer and they actually did this, there's a logic and a narrative to most stories, and they do something that really seems out of place based on everything else they've told you, well, that's a marker that I might want to go back and explore and get a little bit more information on it. So I'm looking for these things as they pop up during the interview, and sometimes you'll see them if you're actively listening, sometimes you won't. Okay? And I make a note of things that I want to circle back to that and ask another question. Does that make sense? Any questions there? Okay. How do you remember things? What makes you remember things? Yes, Liz. Trauma. Yeah. Great, yeah. So those are all great examples. So trauma, my brother, who's an attorney, said way back in the day when they would make important land agreements, and I told him to give me some research on this because I don't believe it's true. Way back in the day when they would make important land agreements, when they would meet to shake hands, they would bring a child with them and slap the child, with the idea that trauma would be that kid would always remember the point at which you bring a young child, right? That means it's in the record for the next 70 years that they would remember that meet up and that event actually happened. I don't advise doing that, okay? Trauma, place, again, you go to your old high school, you pull out your yearbook, maybe even you smell the smell or you hear a sound, or I was driving down the road the other day with my daughter and we were listening to a Journey song, Don't Stop Believing. We're both singing loud. She's having a different experience than I'm having because I'm thinking about high school. She's thinking this is just kind of a cool song. Okay? Those things kind of ignite sights, images, all those things are connected to memory. Now, I would use that in an interview. If you get someone to describe a place, what did it look like, what would be some sounds we would hear, what would be smells associated with it, that sort of thing. Now, I will make the caveat, since you brought it up, and the topic we have at hand, I'm cautious with this with traumatic. Again, I'm not trying to get them to re-experience the event. I am trying to understand their experience of the event, okay? But I may not get them too deeply into this. One of the things that I will do in this, if they perhaps get into something kind of emotional, I will bring them back to something that's a little more tangible. I'm going to play a clip for you from Mr. Chang in a minute. He was emotional during his interview, and at one point I had him describing some things he could see. He was describing the plane. And then he got emotional thinking about his mother, and then I brought him back and we grounded a little bit by talking about something that was a little more tangible, describing the jungle. Okay? So there's a phenomenon of there's hot memories and there's cold memories. There's the things that hot memories generally come at us without any sort of control. Like we didn't want them to come at us. They just come at us. Cold memories are all the other things that exist in your memory. One of the benefits oral history can provide is it can provide a way to integrate hot and cold memories back together. Okay, so I'm telling you the hot memory, but it's within these other cold memories. It's not coming back to me without my control of it. Okay? But all these elements can help us dig up detailed memories. Sometimes with interviews, I'll do an exercise of thinking about the world that they lived in. What would they have worried about? What would they have hoped for? What would they have saved money for? What would have spent their time doing? If I can visualize a little bit, perhaps I can get at some areas that I definitely need to ask about. I'm always asking for elaborations. I'm always getting examples. So this was a difficult time for your mother. Is there a story you can tell me that you think of when you say that? Okay, I want to bring it down from the abstract to the concrete. Tell me a story you think about. One clip that I like is from a son of a Mississippi Delta blacksmith. It was one of my favorite interviews in Mississippi. And he tells the story, says in the interview how poor they were, and then he tells the story about an uncle coming down to hunt and who shot a coon and gave this coon carcass to this 2-year-old, and he played with it for a week, he said. This is not a coonskin cap, this is the carcass of a dead raccoon. He said, after a week, they had to take it away from me. Can you imagine in summer in the Delta what this thing must have looked like after a week? But he just cried and he cried and he cried when he lost that raccoon. And so, again, he'd already said he was poor, right? But a story like that begins, it gives you an example and it gives you kind of some texture of what sort of poverty this kid, his favorite toy as a child was a roadkill raccoon, okay? Powerful example. Silence. Students, I'll encourage you, particularly toward the students, have a challenge with silence, right? You don't get a lot of silence. I had one student I made count to 5 in his head before he could ask the next question. He was so eager. I told him not to count out loud because that might scare the... Anytime there's a countdown unprovoked, it's kind of a scary thing, okay? But just a little bit of space in the interview, maybe they can add a little more detail. You think that this is just a static story that you're retrieving, but they're constructing it in front of you. So giving them a little space to do that is a good thing to do. So I would encourage you to allow Summer to rest for a minute while she's transcribing all this, okay? Just a little bit of space in the interview can be a really productive thing. I would encourage you to practice that. Some of you it may come more natural to, some of you it may be a little more challenging. Some of you are going to want to ask like 4 questions at a time. Don't do that either. 1 question at a time, a little space in the interview can be very fruitful. Difficult areas. As we get into difficult areas, we're thinking about where the landmines might exist in the interview. Sometimes the pre-interview is useful for that. If we have to ask the tougher questions, we want to save those for the last third or last half of the interview. We've built some rapport, we've built some trust, we can get at some more difficult things. I want you to ask about the difficult things. Again, those are the underdocumented elements of their experience. And so I want you to ask about it. If I have controversial things I want to ask, I steal this from journalists. Some people remember that. Some have said that. I would never say, in my research, I've discovered this, or Joe Smith told me this, because then it could become about personalities. And then maybe you put yourself in an oppositional position to them. But some people are very useful. Some people remember this. Was that true in your experience? And perhaps they can deconstruct some people's position. Perhaps they can construct their own position. It's really useful to have in a recording. Okay? So I use some people all the time. Okay, emotions. As we think about emotions during the interview. This project I did with interviewing survivors of genocide was a really unusual project design in that the RFP for the project said they wanted an oral historian and a mental health professional to do the project together. I'm married to a psychologist. So I jumped all over it because I was like, this will be an opportunity to do a grant project with my wife. She actually got paid on the grant. I didn't get paid on the grant. But anyway, I'm a little bitter, but I get my mother-in-law's centerpiece to comfort me. So they wanted that because you might imagine they wanted someone there to assist interviewees, in fact, if they got into stuff that was real difficult for them to share. she did several things on the project. She would talk to them ahead of time. She was there during the interview, and she also debriefed them after the interview. So one of the things she's doing ahead is she's assessing readiness. She's helping me kind of assess readiness if they're really ready to tell this story, because perhaps they're not. During the interview, she was really helpful to me in assessing when we might need to take a break. We did 14 interviews for the project. There were 3 times where we had to take a break during the interview. Okay? I was real selective in taking breaks, and I did not immediately take breaks. Their emotion with regard to their experience is part of this that we want to document, right? So if it's a clean version where no one cries, or if it's a clean version where no one has difficulty telling their story, it's a less than honest representation of the collective experience of this group. And so the times we took a break, generally there's a period on the recording where they're not doing well. Part of what we did ahead of the time is to normalize and let them know that that's okay. We had tissue there for them. We let them know that we would take a break if they needed to. But I also didn't want to dishonor their emotion to the point that if they begin to get emotional that we shut off the recorder, right? Because it is part of honoring their experience to capture their whole story. And so you need to be sensitive to this. You need to let them know that it can be challenging ahead of time and that that's okay. In fact, probably the best thing Melissa did, my wife, in the debrief, I don't know the specifics of any of the debriefs, but she was able to normalize their experience with regard to other people that had experienced, that other people have this as well. We know, you have this, other people's have it. So normalizing their experience, letting them know that this may happen, this is how we're going to handle it, I think is really important when you get into difficult topics. It's not about historical distance. It's not, as far as chronological distance, the 100-year-old woman in Columbus I mentioned lost it talking about the 1927 Mississippi flood. She had a story. She was in Greenville during the flood and still had a story that was really hard for her to share. And so there can be an artificiality where we think just the passage of time is going to make it less difficult, and that's not necessarily the case. So you just really want to be sensitive. All the other elements that I talked about become especially important when you're dealing with traumatic and sensitive topics. Any other questions here related to this? I know I'm covering a lot, but okay. Okay, these are all the things that you're going to say I didn't prepare you for, so I'm going to talk about it. They just want to talk, okay? They don't stay on subject. I would ask myself the question if I really explained what I'm doing there today, okay, and why I'm doing it. I send people a letter in advance explaining the purpose of the project and why their participation is important. And then I remind them of that, okay, and what we're trying to accomplish with the project. It can help them stay on subject. I already gave you the 15-minute example, and we talked about spouses. You're assessing whether that's a benefit or not. They will not stop or turn off to something that makes a loud and or annoying noise. I'll let them know we're going to use this in a variety of ways. That gift statement I'm going to give them is going to say that, but I want to remind them we need as good a recording as possible. And then towards the end of the interview, we ask summary questions. What else would you like to talk about that we didn't get to? Anything I failed to ask you about you think I should know? Some people ask, what questions should I have asked you? Or a student comes to this in 50 years, what's the most important thing about X that you would want them to know? Okay. We're asking them to do a little more work and be analytical here, but it can be productive. All right, if we think about outcomes, we're working for the best sound quality. We're collecting images if we can. Even with audio, I would encourage you to do at least some still photography, okay, because we want the visual element. It's very important to have. We can even do audio and some segmented video if we want to. Okay? If we want to capture the recording and do a little more produced version where they're sharing particular stories, and those can have a little higher production value. We can transcribe or decide if we want to transcribe. But we do want to make sure we have this legal agreement signed. It's a deed of gift that says they're giving the interview. You can either do a deed of gift or a contract, and I would imagine most of you don't want to buy this. So you're going to do a deed of gift, where they're going to give the interview to you, or they're going to give the interview to an archive. Okay. What's great about oral history is the way we work. They keep the same rights to their interview as the archive keeps to their interview. Okay? This is why when I would call someone in Mississippi, every civil rights activist in Mississippi are writing their memoirs. That was a phenomenon that seemed inexhaustible. They're not writing their memoirs, but they're writing their memoirs. So I'd call them, they would say, well, you know, I don't really want to do the interview, I'm writing my memoirs. And I would say, that's great, let's do the interview, and then I'll give it to you and you can use it to write your memoirs. You have the same rights to it as we do. So we got a backup in case the memoirs don't get written. I'm going to talk a little bit about technology, just so we can get kind of an overview of what we want from technology at this point. This, of course, is a shifting rubric all the time. What's nice about audio, again, is we've kind of stabilized archival standards for audio. We have not stabilized archival standards for video yet. We record in a WAV format, and we record at CD audio quality or better. Okay? But these are some elements that you would want in an audio recorder. I hate for all of you to have to write this. Is there any way for me to email this later to the group? Okay, so I'll email this later to the group. You don't have to write all this down. We want it to be connectable. I will point this out. We partnered with a group in South Mississippi, and they sent back their interviews. One of them was on one of those stick recorders. The demon of the analog world was the little mini cassette recorder. Weren't they adorable? I don't know if you've ever seen those that have cassettes. I hate those things. The demon of the digital world is the little stick, little Olympus stick recorder where you say, buy tuna fish, and then you play back later, buy tuna fish. So someone sent us one in, and there was no way to get the recording off. So I had to play it out loud and record it with a better recorder. Not a very good audio quality. So these are things that you want. This is that setup we saw earlier. There are elements of concern I would have with this setup. One would be this table. What if he starts drumming his fingers or things like that? At least he's got his coffee mug is sitting on a coaster. So every time he picks it up and set it down, it's not going to make as much noise. But you would think about those things with your setup. Video. We want a video camera that can record very well in low light. And we also want something that allows for a lot of manual control of video. It's not all automatic. We want something that's very manual. I was watching a video that had autofocus, and a guy was sitting in a rocking chair, and he would rock back and it would try to focus, and he would rock forward and it would try to focus, and he would rock back and it would try to focus. This camera must have been smoking by the end of this interview. Okay? So they needed manual control, or actually they needed another chair, but they needed something to keep it from autofocusing. Some general elements for recording good video. We want to use the rule of thirds, framing our subject. We're going to see this with Mr. Chang here in a minute. Face and upper torso. We don't want to pan and zoom. Okay. We want to use a tripod. I realize the Cloverfield effect is something that you think is kind of cool on video with the jerky camera where it looks like someone's being chased. Don't do that in your interview. Okay. Use a tripod. They're cheap. One person interviewing, one person recording. See how that happened? That was amazing. Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. It's always nice to have backup recording as well. This is the recorder I use. I use a Marantz. Pricing, people are always interested in pricing. The Marantz is not a cheap recorder. It's about $300, but there are very good recorders around the $100 price point that will produce great audio. Okay? For all sorts of reasons, please don't use your phone to produce archivable audio. So this is my setup again. We can see what it looks like. Key lights. That's my mic. If I'm doing video, I need a depth to that video, so I need to put the camera quite a ways away from Mr. Chang. You can see my backup audio recorder here. This is actually my wife over here. She's got glaring look number 4, contrasting my pensive look number 4. Okay. And there's a shotgun mic, because I want to get better audio there. So I thought I would play you a clip just so you can see it. Let's see what Chang looks like. That's what it looked like in the room. Let me show you what it looks like on camera. This is really, I didn't set this up very well. It's a pretty powerful clip. This is something Mr. Chang does towards the end of his interview unprompted. And you're going to get a sense in this of kind of why I'm doing the project, and he really explains quite well why he's doing the project.
You sharing it, I know it's hard for you to put into words for us to understand, and it's hard to try, but I appreciate you trying, because we want to understand and we want others to be able to understand. And the only way they can is through you sharing your experiences. So thank you.
I want to thank also for having this moment of the opportunity to make my voice, where 2 million have no voice at all. Have no voice. Besides them crying for help. I want to appreciate each one of you to make this voice known. It's not me, but their voice too. The voice of the suffering, the voice of justice, the voice of freedom. Those are the kind of voice that they long for, and they never have it. At least I voice it out for them, not just me.
Yeah, it's a really powerful clip, and he had a real sense of why he was doing this. There's a lot of powerful things about that clip for me. That scarf he's wearing, he chose to wear in the interview, was a scarf his mother gave him last time he saw her, which was 1976. So, you know, there he has a sense of why he's doing this. You know, I will tell people when they're hesitant to interview, and most people's major objection is, I don't have anything interesting to say. You know, they're usually lying. They don't know they are. But I will tell people as a historian, listen, if you don't speak for you, other people are going to speak for you. You know, they're going to write the history of blank. You know, I think it's better if your voice is included in shaping how that history is written, and oral history gives us an opportunity to do that. And so Mr. Chang had a real sense of that. I talked about the value of still photography, and so we do social media, of course. You know, so having a visual element is really important. This is a billionaire, a nice billionaire, which is always nice to meet a nice billionaire. Any billionaire is good, but a nice billionaire is even better. That's Drayton McClain, who owned the Houston Astros. I'm going to talk real quickly about elements of management. Okay. Any other questions on interviewing? Okay. If we think about things to accession, I just want to give you a sense of how we accession things. This is that interview data form that has the information about the interview. That is the gift form, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. All that goes into a folder, and that folder arrives in the department, and that goes into the queue to be a session. Okay? And so the office knows that if all these don't live in here, it's not an interview yet. Okay? Because I'm not going to start working on it until we have all these things in place. I am one that has to have a copy of it live somewhere before I can go to sleep. It's got to live somewhere else. So if I go and do a recording, I'm at least going to put it on a cloud share before I go to sleep, so I know it lives 2 places. Okay? I lost a master's thesis chapter one time, and the only value, right, there has to be a good story that comes out of it, right? The only value of that is I'm paranoid now about redundancy, and so I'll throw it up on Box to make sure it lives there as well. This is some suggestions of naming conventions you can use. This is the naming convention that we use at the Institute that has last name, first initial, middle name, and then the date of the interview to distinguish from serial interviews, which a lot of what we have is serial interviews in the collection. So that's the naming convention. You can use that if you want. It's just important that you standardize that naming convention. And this will make you blind, but I thought I'd show you our processing flow chart. So, so look, this is record the interview. And this is everything else that happens after the recording of the interview. I keep this in mind as I'm doing an interview, right? It makes me much more intentional during the interview process if I realize how much work I'm creating down the line. So something to keep in mind. I don't have to transcribe my own stuff anymore, which is great, but I need to understand that there are transcriptionists that are having to work on whatever I produce. So it's quite a flow chart. Yeah, these are, this is a word list that could be generated out of the interview. This is an abstract that could be generated out of the interview. And this is me with an interviewee signing the gift form. I generally have them sign the gift form at the end of the interview. Other oral historians disagree with me on that. I do that because I don't feel like they know what they're going to give me until they've given it. I'm running a little risk there, but I think it's worth it. All right, I'll skip metadata because that would really put you to sleep. All the information that we need to gather about the collection itself. The data about the data. If we think about the recording principles, we want to record for long-term access and preservation. We want to use the best equipment that we can. Again, there's all sorts of solutions for recording. We want to anticipate obsolescence, as you said, looking ahead to see how trends run. I can tell you the market cares less what oral historians want. But photographers like SD cards. And so SD card's going to be with us for a while. So we record on devices that have removable media that has an SD card in it. And the great digital rule, lots of copies keep stuff safe. Okay, so we put it in multiple places. 5 copies in a desk drawer is not multiple places. Okay. We archive, of course, for all these reasons. For preservation, we want it to reach a broader audience. This is what I spend a lot of time talking to individual researchers about you're creating a collection. And what does it mean to create a collection? Because they've never done that before. They've researched, they've produced an article, and then they moved on. I thought I would suggest just some other tools to keep in mind. Audacity, I mentioned earlier, is a great audio editing tool that's free. The one, if you're wanting to clip and do some easy edits on audio, my oral history seminar students are using this right now. The one thing that they better not be doing is working on their preservation master, but they'll make an MP3 copy of that wave and then they can work on it. It can be a working copy where they can do some edits from. We never want to work on that preservation copy. Remember not wanting to rewind the original tape? It's the same principle, okay? We don't want to mess with the original. All sorts of storage options that you can use, that you can suggest, from external options that I mentioned earlier, portable hard drives, to cloud storage options. A lot of these cloud storage options have free alternatives that you can use, and that can work quite well for audio. We even have something like Glacier, Amazon Glacier, which only pays it only charges you to use it if you access it. So it can go there and live in deep storage. This is cold, deep storage. But for you to know it's somewhere and it's somewhere being stored up. So just the idea, if you don't have that at an institutional level, there are individual options to make sure something is tucked away and in place. I'll talk about transcribing just briefly in case you're interested in transcribing. I realize my time is getting short. Researchers love transcripts, right? They can move through them quicker. We can read faster than we can listen. They're searchable. Audio is not searchable yet. We're getting close, but it's not searchable yet. It allows for interviewee review, which can be really important. So one of the things we do is we still transcribe and allow the interviewees to review their transcript. And that gives them comfort that they can do that. It's time consuming, it's expensive, it's all these things. Nonverbal sounds are sometimes fun. We had a woman talking about riveting. She was kind of a Rosie during World War II. She made the sound of a riveter. We had a long discussion about how to represent that in text. You have those fun sort of conversations. So there are benefits and problems with both alternative. This is something that comes up every time I present. Isn't there a machine that'll do that for us? Voice recognition offers some great promise. It still has challenges with dual speakers, which oral history at least has dual speakers. I don't use voice recognition in our office mainly because it introduces errors into the transcript, which I don't want, and then I got to go back and pull them all out. But it's getting there. It's getting there. Yeah, so the error rate with one speaker is about 8%. With two speakers, it's about 20%. So, still not there yet. There are a bunch of automated transcribing services out there if you want to experiment with some of those. And we generally, every couple of years, do an experiment to see how they're doing. The one that we're trying out this summer is Trent, which is a British company. Right now, I'm trying to convince Baylor to let us pay a British company. So, yeah. But that's administrative red tape. You don't need to hear that. Okay. If you're going to transcribe, there's transcription software that you can download. Again, this is not automatic transcription software, but it's transcription software that we use, Express Scribe, and then of course you want a foot pedal, which I tell my grad students it's like the worst video game ever. Okay, transcribing. Okay, but it has interactive components. I'll recommend our style guide. We have a free style guide online. If you're editing and transcribing, you can use that, and we use Chicago Manual of Style. We got mentioned in the Chicago Manual of Style blog as a tool for transcription. The editors at our office, oh man, that was like being called home. I mean, that was like the ultimate experience, Chicago Manual of Style. This is a very narrow form of geek that we make edit our transcripts, and they were so stoked that the Chicago Manual of Style recognized them. Okay? And I showed you before, we can do things that we don't want to transcribe. We can do word list, which this really isn't a finding aid, but it's more a tool for transcription where difficult names or words would be in a word list. They speed up the transcription process tremendously. We used to keep, I know I don't have time to tell the story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. We used to keep transcribing mistakes in the break room, and then the students got mad and we stopped. So in other words, what the person said in the interview and what the student transcribed that they said during the interview. We used to post them, the mistakes in the break room. Like, one was, it was a Baylor interview, and the interviewee said the Board of Regents decided. The transcript says the Puerto Ricans decided. So, but they got upset, and so we took them down. So we can abstract if we don't want to transcribe, that we just give a general abstract to the interview. And you can see this one very usefully has timestamps in it, so it can operate as a bit of an index to move through the interview, kind of a table of contents for the interview, quicker than full transcription. I'm going to point you to this. I'm not going to go through the legal and ethical considerations just because our time is getting limited. But I do want to point you to the principle and best practices page. Those are constantly shifting and changing. Okay, some of the best practices for oral history. We just updated them last year at our annual meeting. And with regard to legal issues, I'm going to point you to this publication, Oral History and the Law. It has samples of gift forms that you can use and you can copy and use. Gift forms, it's very important. They have all sorts of elements to them, including intended uses and anticipated possible uses of the interview material. Okay? It's important for them to sign and for your interviewers, whoever your interviewers are on the project, to sign. Okay, I'm skipping this. We're skipping the ethics. I've been talking about a lot of this as we go along. Because I want to show you something towards the end. This is important. As they sign this gift form, they're conveying copyright. We know this in an archival sense. They're conveying copyright to you to be able to use the interview. A transcript is a derivative work, and so I'm not going to produce a transcript unless I have copyright to that interview. Okay. That's the future use that I mentioned. There are cases where we may restrict an interview if they don't want it available for a period of time. Generally, I would recommend you do a time-limited restriction. Okay? In other words, till my death or 10 years after my death or something like that. There are cases where interviewees want to be anonymous. We don't encourage that, but we can accommodate it. Sometimes we set up terms of use for the interview for a period of time. They can be accessed and used with my approval. Those would only be for a period of time. We generally have for restrictions a safety net statement, and this is how we would set up restrictions with these following restrictions. The safety net statement would be the case that the Boston College case is the most infamous recent example of this, where a murder trial subpoenaed some restricted interview material, and the subpoena overcame the restriction on the material. It was interviews about the IRA operation in Ireland, and the subpoena overrode the restrictions to get at the restricted interview material. And so because of that, you'll see any gift now have a safety net statement in it saying, you know, we will defend your restriction, but there in cases this subpoena can override this. And there's not a lot of case law in oral history, but there are some examples of where this has happened. There's me with darker hair. Not much, but a little bit darker. Okay. Again, these other resources I would point you to, the OHA, the Guide to Oral History, and if there's special issues, you can talk with a lawyer. In this last section, I'll just remind you of all the open source free stuff you can use now to share your oral histories. It's really amazing. These platforms that are highly sophisticated and they're publicly available to use. And we take advantage of them, and I would encourage you to do it as well. From WordPress, which there's a free version of, you can present oral histories that way, to Ameca, which can be a database that you would use, and there's levels of versions of that. I'll show you an example that I use. I have an app and website on local history that I use that reads from Ameca. SoundCloud, there's a free version of SoundCloud to present oral history. Even the Oral History Review, the journal, they use SoundCloud to present their audio excerpts. We use YouTube to present video. Again, there are probably more expensive options that I could use, but it's accessible, and I can set different levels of accessibility to it. I can direct it only through my website. It's available, which is important if I want to contextualize the way it's presented, right? I just don't want them coming to it cold on YouTube. I can contextualize it. This is a tool I thought I would show you quickly. Is that all right if I go a little bit over, Liz? All right? Okay. She gave me permit. You heard she said yes. It was under duress, but okay. I thought I would show you OHMS right quick, which is the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer. I want to show you an example of what that is. This is a free tool as well. That's Mr. William Dippo, but the clip I'm going to show you is from Chick Havey, who was a liberator that I interviewed. Bless you. Okay, so you can see here there is an index to this video. So if I want to hear about him going to parachute school, I can click here and it'll skip to there in the interview and in the video. So the video will progress to that point as well. So his deployment.
And course, you didn't know if you're going to, at that point, if you were going to North Africa or if you're going to Europe.
Not to a certain point till we got on the train.
Yeah.
So there's some hick asking questions there. Okay. So I can have the index there, or I could have, if I have a full transcript, I can put the full transcript there. And I can move through the full transcript. And so what it allows me to do, I can search the transcript and also be searching the video to a particular section. And so OHMS is a very useful tool. Chick Havey, a year after I interviewed him, I got a call from a researcher, and they said, I saw you interview Chick Havey. Is that the same Chick Havey that was involved in organized crime in Chicago in the 1950s? And I said, I don't know. I didn't ask him about it, but yes. That guy was a tough dude. He kind of had that feel as a guy you wouldn't want to mess with. Okay. And of course, along with those digital tools, there's all sorts of ways to promote your materials as well. And ultimately, we want to share, inform, highlight, give, and show off the hard work that we've done. We can do these more traditional publications to highlight the work that we've done, or we can exhibit. Exciting things happening in exhibiting oral history. And I was reminded of this spring break. I went to DC, and I went to 3 different museums I'm going to show you right quickly, and they all had a heavy oral history component related to them. This is the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum that has a room you go into and you can listen to stories. And so it's not as interactive, but there's a book in there and there's stories being played, and we're listening in a room together and we're hearing the stories. Or something like the National Museum of African American History and Culture that has a share your own story at every floor as you leave that floor. It's really interesting from a public history standpoint. As you leave every floor and you're going to walk up to the next floor, it's genius how they laid out that museum. You start by going to the basement, and then you work your way up. It's very metaphorical. I mean, you work your way up. As you leave each floor, there's a share your story booth where you can go in and share elements of your story, and they record it. And so I'm not going to play it for you, but there's visitor voices with the National Museum of African American History. You can go and look on YouTube and see what people have shared. So it can be your family's experience with slavery. It's kind of how you've dealt with injustice. They have several prompts you can choose to share a story about. And even the Museum of the Bible I went to, there's a little booth you can go in, and the question is, how does the Bible impact you? You go in and share your story, and then on the outside there's a screen with different people who have shared their story, and you can touch and have them share their story. So very heavy first-person kind of sharing component that you'll see in all museum exhibits now. A couple of projects that I've worked on. Living Stories is a NPR project we did where we used segments of oral histories and presented those on local public broadcasting radio. And then the app and the podcast I mentioned down here, using elements of oral history on both of those. It's got an interactive kind of place-based storytelling app. And of course, if you want to see documentaries done with oral history, I love Southern Foodways Alliance that's in Mississippi. They'll do different projects related to foodways in the South, and they do a great job creating very simple. One of my favorite ones is the Tamale Trail in Mississippi. And so they'll pick different topics. There's a great barbecue trail they go on and things like that. So you can see simple ways in which they'll take a few interviews and create a very compelling online documentary. And of course, Community and Classrooms project. This is the Survivors of Genocide project we did. It's going to be in curriculum in Texas for teaching genocide. And this Houston Community College joint project with the Houston Metropolitan Research Center is on restaurants in Houston. And they produced an online exhibit from it. You can do performances. There's a great performance called Gator Tales where they went and did interviews on the integration of the University of Florida, and they produced a play based on the interviews that were conducted. It's very well done. It's won a bunch of awards Or there's, of course, individual performers that use oral history to do readers' theater, working with the transcript, or monologues that are more expressive. Before I close, additional resources I would point you to. We've got a couple of online workshops coming up. We have an advanced workshop at the end of May on legal and ethical issues. Since I went over that quickly, you could join that. And then we have a basic workshop that's a 2-3 hour session at the beginning of August. I also want to let you know about TOHA. First off, you have to appreciate this new logo. Do you get it? See, it's a recording button, and then it's the O. Okay. So we have a free conference every year, and we have people that from Colorado that come every year to the TOHA conference. So you can cross the state line and come to the TOHA conference. This is the Texas Oral History Association. It's a great place if you've done a project, you want to present a project. It's a great, friendly group to come. It's a free conference. That doesn't exist, but it exists at TOHA. And so next year we're having it at Baylor because it's our 50th anniversary, so we're going to have it back at Baylor. So come to that. That would be fun. All right. I know you don't have any. It's like asking if we're way past time, but any pressing questions you have, I would encourage you individually maybe to come up and ask. Would that be the best way to do it since I've gone over time?
Yeah, absolutely. Does anybody have any questions at this moment? So our department scheduled a end of the year thing at 3:30. So that's why you see a couple of people running out.
Yeah.
So trying to squeeze it in at the same time. So, but we're more than welcome to stick around and ask additional questions. I know I have some
I'm happy
as
to
well.
hang around as long as you have questions.
Yeah. Questions?
I have a really quick question.
Right.
So I'm in a historical archaeology class right now, and one of the things that we talked about was using artifact-based oral histories. So when you bring in an artifact from someone's home, or maybe something that has to do with their culture or their family, and using that to sort of trigger memories that they might overlook or think are insignificant. Have you done any of that before?
Yeah, we had I did a project called. It was really an interesting approach to homelessness. We did a project called What I Keep. And it was an interview. You can understand being homeless, you have to be selective about what you keep and what you don't keep. And so you would only keep something that would be very precious to you because of all the work that goes along with keeping something. And so we did it with, we did portraiture with it, where we had a photographer kind of do a picture of them with whatever it is they keep. And then the oral history was kind of centered around whatever that object was and their story in relation to that object, kind of looking at the layers of meaning with regard to that object. So, yeah, I think that could be a really interesting project. And I think you would at least want still photography to go along with it. But video might be great as well with a project like that, but that's interesting. Yeah.
And the departmental event's going to be at 3:45 now. Just letting everybody know.
Oh, wow. I moved the departmental event?
Moved it.
Man, I don't have that power at Baylor. I got to tell them back home.
So we recently had the experience of our TIBO agent and I were listening to an oral history over again, and an elder came in and it was an interview with her mother, and she just started filling in the blanks. How do you feel about something like that? Like random like phrases she used in Kosati that we didn't quite understand, or when she spoke about, oh yeah, the other church or the other land, and then all of a sudden she Miss Barb filled in the blanks. How do you feel about using oral histories to trigger other memories and then possibly recording that as well?
Was that happening within the interview itself, or was it happening after the interview?
Afterwards. She happened to walk in while we were re-listening to this, trying to pull some information from it.
Yeah, I think it would be perfectly acceptable to kind of pull things from, I learn from interview to interview, right? So I'm also thinking about that in my project design, who I want to interview first, who I want to interview second. Usually the first interview I do is with the gatekeeper to that community, whoever that might be, and they never have that name, but you can figure out who they are. If you ask a question, who do they look at to respond to the question? But I would learn from interview to interview, and kind of pulling things from that interview. Okay, this is interesting. How can I use this to stimulate a conversation in other interviews or draw on conversation in other interviews? And so, yeah, I think that's great. So I would do it in the way that I shared with you. I wouldn't attach it to that person. But some people have used terms like this. What do you think of when I share that term? Or something like that. I think could be really, really interesting. The problem of playing them and then having them respond to it is it could get into personalities. I remember when I went to the Mississippi Band of Choctaw, and someone shared a story that they got in an interview, and immediately the communal response was, well, who shared that they wanted to know who shared that story and why did they share it and why did they tell you? And it was really, really kind of interesting. And so I would be cautious with identifying it to a person, but I think you could definitely enrich the interview. So, but, I wonder how far we could push that departmental event. Let's just keep going. No, just kidding.
I had a quick question for you. So this series has talked a lot about not only how do we respond after a disaster, which oral history is definitely one of those avenues that should be incorporated in our disaster response and kind of this recovery aspect, but also about the physical preservation of things from our communities and how we preserve those when a disaster occurs. I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit more about that aspect of preserving those types of oral histories and things that you have found with oral history institutions that have been suffering from a crisis. So an event has just occurred, and what do they do? How do they respond to this? What sort of things should they be thinking of in their disaster plan and then in their response?
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah. So you're talking about preserving the existing collections that they have, in principle? Yeah. Yeah. So we had this with the Biloxi Public Library. Had all their interviews in a cabinet on the first floor, and so we had that all in tanks, trying to recover, all that audio information. I remember going down and helping on the coast, and the thing that survived Katrina was everybody's Christmas decorations, because they were all in the attic, So we had everyone's Christmas decorations because the water didn't get in the attic. But everything else was gone. And so I think very quickly about having a clear plan of kind of steps that you would take. What's nice since 2005 in particular is the avenues that we've talked about for off-site storage, and checksum elements that can be run to make sure the integrity of that storage and the assurance of that storage. I think so having protocols in place where you're regularly backing things up at another location is extremely important. Nothing needs to live just at your facility anymore. And so if we were at that point in 2005 where that was the case, but there's no excuse for that being the case now. And so I think thinking of a plan of the ways in which things migrate to some sort of off-site storage, and then the regular interaction that your unit or you as an individual have with that off-site storage to ensure it is there and available. I even get nervous at times with trusting one commercial entity with my storage, right? If you had Enron stock, you understand, okay? If we trust one commercial solution, what is the challenges? You're not a priority for that commercial solution. And so I would think creatively about building a strategy where you've diversified your storage, where you know it's going to be available if you need it. So that'd be the biggest piece of advice I think I would give. So you got to digitize it first before you can do that. So digitization is what you've got to be doing now if you have analog materials.
So I think some of the students are a little shy talking about how they're working with oral histories, but at least two of them are using oral history collections, creating oral history collections, and using those as the basis for their theses. Wonderful. And so you had mentioned.
Let me guess which one.
I've been kind of staring at them, hoping that they would ask this question. So you had mentioned that putting out an announcement in the newspaper is not a good idea.
It's a last resort.
Okay, so yeah. I think because that's, I think, something that has come up in discussion, which is how to identify people who would be possible people to interview. And so other venues or media were social media or history harvests. And so I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about what you think are better ways to identify possible people to interview.
Yeah, I think getting at informal networks, one of the challenges of the students our age is that they've put it on Facebook, so they think everybody knows about it now, which is, you know, if you have 10 likes, 9 other people know about it. But just working through networks, so if I'm interviewing, I had a student approach me that wanted to do interviews on Italian Americans, and I said, Italian Americans in Texas, communities in Texas. I said, where did you go? And he said, I put something on Facebook. Where else could we look, you know? And so I went to restaurants, I went to community centers, I went to churches, I went to, you know, getting in some of these associations, what would be some common causes that they might be invested in? You know, with refugee groups, we went through immigrant service organizations to get at some of these groups. We went through mutual aid associations to get at some of these groups. We went to places that would have services that they may be interested in to see if we could then network into the community. And so I think you've got to, it's not easy. It's not easy, it's hard. My problem with advertising is they're self-selecting whether they should, they're telling you that they should be a part of your project. You know, I want you to have a research design where you have a sense of who would make an ideal interviewee, and you select. You've got a little bit more of the power of who to pick. If we can get into a community group at any level, they can begin to help us kind of vet and identify who needs to be interviewed and maybe in what order they need to be interviewed. One of the reasons why I try to find gatekeepers to interview is they then turn around and explain what I'm doing to everyone else in their community. It's okay, he's okay, it's not scary, this is a trustworthy person. And then, I mean, I've even gotten to the point where gatekeepers like setting up appointments for me, and they're baking me cookies and introducing me to people and that sort of thing. And so I'm not saying you can't put the ad in the paper, but I would say let's exhaust all the other creative possibilities before that. You know, there are still listings for people in the phone book, and so if we can identify people that we think might be possible interviewees, can we approach them and ask them about, take a friend with you, but can we approach them and ask them about participating in the project if they fit with what you're looking for? I just would rather you be more active in making your interview pool rather than being passive. I mean, the worst passive thing is what we call salvage oral history, which means there's an old person, they must need to be interviewed, which that's not a very good research design, right? Once you hit 80, you know, your reward is you get an oral history. Let's think more creatively about who needs to be included in the interview pool. And there needs to be other criteria besides just that. Maybe, but maybe not. So, does that help? Does that help? Whoever you might be and hiding up there. Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
We can't push back the department.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Okay.
So that and the Light Center is going to kick us out too. So
okay.
That's all right. Please join me in giving Dr. Sloan a round of applause.
Thank you.
I know I got a lot out of today, and many of you use oral history, so this was very helpful as well. So thank you all for attending the Archives in Crisis series. If you're part of the department, you're welcome to come over to the departmental awards, and even if you're not, you're welcome to come over. It'll be on Griffin 315, so that wonderful building that Dr. Sloan was talking about with no signage.
I didn't say the building was bad. I just said the signage
No,
was bad.
we have problems with Griffin. Yeah, so
I can't go over there. I pushed it back. They'll go, oh, that's the guy.
But thank you all very much.